What I'm going to be attempting to do here is show you how I made these small wire guides if you're into rod building and things like that. I'm actually making these guides for a very specific purpose, and I'm going to be building a rod. I'm not going to get into that too much right now because I'm not ready to do it yet, but I am starting to make some of the parts for it, and it's just going to be a unique rod, and hopefully it'll work the way I anticipate it will. But so far I've made 3 of the guides, and I've got a little bit more work to do to the feet. But I kind of thought, maybe somebody would want to see the process I was doing to make these. What I'm using to make the guides is some stainless steel leader wire, and this is the tooth-proof type from AFW, American Fishing Wire, and it's a 195-pound test. All I'm doing is taking a section of wire and cutting it off, and I'm using this little tool here, which is marketed towards people that use electronic cigarettes. It's for wrapping coils out of wire. It'll actually work for making the loop part of the guides and keeping them consistent. And what I'm trying to do with these guides, at least for the smallest ones, is make them all approximately the same size. So if you're interested, hang around and I will show you what I was doing to make these, and hopefully it shows up on camera okay. Okay, so I've got this little jig here, and I'm just going to back the screw off on it some to get started, and I am going to cut a piece of wire that is approximately twice the size of this jig. So somewhere in here and there. So I'm going to cut this piece right about here. And you will have some waste wire from each guide, but it's a lot easier to do this if you have a longer piece on each end for using it for leverage to bend the wire. So what I'm going to do now is just take this wire and I'm going to insert it on this side, which is my left. If you're looking at it, it'd be your right. But I'm going to tighten this down here under that screw to where it can't move. Then I'm just going to pull this up and over to the opposite side. So now it's running across this pin. Now you do is just take this jig and hold your wire and begin pulling it. Now this does take a little bit of force, and you want to try to keep your coil that you're wrapping pretty tight. That'll just make less work for you later. Now I've wrapped the wire 2 times. I've got 2 pieces of wire at the top of my coil, and that's what I was looking for. So this is ready to come off of here. Now that's all I use that for, is just to make a nice consistent loop in the wire. Okay, now the way I've been making these is there's one leg that runs pretty much straight forward and another one that bends around to it. Well, the one that runs pretty straight is actually pulled from behind the back side of the coil to the front. So that's what I'm going to do right now, is pull one leg from the coil I just wrapped to the front side. And to do that, I'm using these little pliers that are used for making bead jewelry, and it's used for making wraps and wire and things like that. And they're just 2 tapered pins that come out of the end of the pliers. These are real handy, and I'll also be using some needle nose pliers. Okay, I've got my coil here, and I'm going to try to pull this wire up to the front. And I'm going to try to do that keeping the wraps pretty tight on the coil. And a lot of this is just bending and manipulating the wire, and it's just by sight. So no 2 of these guides are going to be exactly consistently the same. So all I'm shooting for here is to keep these pretty similar looking. And you just kind of play around with the pliers. You'll have to experiment with them to come up with different methods of manipulating the wire without distorting your loop too much. I'm starting to get a little spread in my loop here, so I'll go back and try to tighten that up some. And this is time consuming, and it's certainly not for everyone. I just thought if somebody might be interested, I'd put the video out there and it might be helpful to someone. Okay, now I've got this wire pulled more towards the front. I'm going to take some needle nose pliers and actually hold the wire with it, because it will keep it from slipping as much, and it also helped me keep this loop together here. So now I'm just going to bend this wire around more towards the front. And you want to be careful when you're using needle nose pliers. You want to be careful not to scuff up the inside of the wire where your line will be running through there. You won't have raggedy parts on the inside of this loop for your line to snag on and for it to fray the line on. You want to make sure that this stays on the inside of the loop, stays nice and smooth. Now I've got this wire pulled to the front. I'm going to try to shape it to where the wire that's running from behind to the front goes almost in the center of the loop and then straight back out forward. And this is just kind of a trial and error to get everything bent the way you want to. This wire is pretty tough stuff, and it can take a lot of, I guess what I'd call abuse on bending it back and forth without it being weakened significantly. But you do want to be careful about how much you are bending the wire. If you overdo it, of course, it'll fatigue the metal and make a weak spot in it. Okay, now I've got my wire pulled from the back, running back towards the front, and it's pretty center of my loop. So now I'll need to start working on bringing this leg down and over to it. And the way I've been doing that is using mostly needle nose pliers to kind of manipulate this wire to give it a little bit of a bent inward shape. It kind of runs down, over, and then back out to run alongside the other leg that we've already bent over. And this area is a little different between, you're not going to get exactly the same bends on each one, but you can get them to where they look very similar, and by using the coil tool for your loops, you'll be pretty consistent in your opening size on each of the guides. Alright, to bend this over, I'm going to just kind of grab this close to the loop, bend this down to where it's sticking out. So now I've got these two, they're not running exactly parallel to each other, but it's pretty close. So now I'm going to start working on bending this section from where this bend I just created is down a little ways in towards this other leg. And again, I'm just using needle nose to do this bend. I'm just going to grab this wire and try to pull this leg over. Something like that. Now what I've got to do is bend this section back in this direction. Now I've got these two kind of crossed over here. I'm going to continue trying to bend this flat section right here back towards this corner on the back side where I pulled the first wire through. The gap right here, I'm going to try to close that gap up somewhat by taking this flat side and heading and moving it this direction. Okay, now I've got that pulled over. I have to bend this leg back out this way. To try to get these legs running closer together. And you can start to see the guide is taking shape somewhat. That's the basic shape of the guide. Now it's just a matter of manipulating this further until I get it more closely to what I want exactly. There's not really a good way for me to describe the whole process because it's kind of a trial and error on each one. It's time consuming. It probably takes doing it off camera, it probably takes me 5 minutes to make a guide, between 5 and 10 minutes, just depending on how lucky I get on guessing where I make my bends and everything. But so it is time consuming. It's definitely easier to buy guides and do it that way. But you know, you can get a whole roll of this stainless steel wire and make a whole lot of guides for very little money. And because this rod that I'm building is an experimental rod and I'm not sure how well it's going to work, I really don't want to invest a whole lot of money in it personally. Some people don't care. I guess money's expense and cost and things like that's all relative. It's not that I can't afford to do it. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me to spend a whole lot of money on a rod that may or may not actually do what I'm hoping it will do. And I'm kind of doing something I've never seen anybody else try before. Of course, I haven't seen everything that everybody's tried, but I just kind of had an idea for making a kind of a unique fly rod. And I will get more into that when I get ready to do the build. But I just thought I had a really unique idea and it was something I wanted to try out first before I presented it to everybody. But making these guides is something, you know, that I thought, you know, a lot of people might find useful for different applications. So I'm going to go ahead and do the video on that. And you're just kind of working the wire, trying to make sure that your gap between the two pieces of wire is pretty tight. You don't want a real wide gap between those two, something that line could potentially get snagged in. And I'll actually be using one of these for the tip top itself, just wrapping it onto the rod and putting epoxy over it to hold it in place instead of a tube type tip. This guide's pretty much ready to go. I will just need to cut the legs off to shorter length. When I wrap these, I will be putting a little epoxy in this gap right here that I've created, and I will fill this in to an extent, not all the way up to the round part, but just a couple of millimeters in this area, and that will also help keep the guide from sliding in and out of the wrap. Then also the epoxy will soak into the threads and lock into this somewhat too. And I think for the type of fishing I plan on doing this, which is, you know, maybe fish up to 10 pounds at the largest, I don't think I will have any problems with these holding on the rods firmly. They seem like they're going to be just fine for that. Now that this guy's complete, really all I need to do is cut the length of it off to where it's not so long. And that's about it. It's a pretty simple process. And of course, you know, these aren't going to be super fancy guides or anything, but for a long time, wire guides were very common. And you still see them a lot in the form of snake guides on fly rods. This stainless steel leader wire should give me a lot of protection from corrosion and things also, so shouldn't really have any problem with these guides for the useful life of the rod. If I do, I can always go back and replace them later with something else. But just to get going on this project and to keep from investing a whole lot of money in it, this just seemed like a pretty good way to go about doing that to me. If I like it, you know, I might do a build in the future for it, where I use something store-bought. But for now, this will get me started on it. And I might just leave it like it is if it works really well. Sometimes if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But I just wanted to show y'all that. That's my fourth guide. I've still got to cut it off, trim it to length, and I've got one more to make. But I just thought that would give me a chance to show y'all something that someone might find useful.